It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine Wessinger, who is a friend and a mentor to me. Dr. Wessinger is the professor of the history of religions at Loyola University in New Orleans. She's the author of How the Millennium Comes Violently, From Jonestown to Heaven's Gate, which was published in 2000. She's also the editor of Millennialism, Persecution, and Violence, which is a collection of essays, and the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Millennialism, which came out in 2011. She is co-general editor of Nova Religio, the Journal of Alternative and Emergent Religions, which is published by the University of California Press. In this presentation, Dr. Wessinger will report on her oral history project with 4 Branch Davidian survivors, which she began in 2004 and has resulted in the publication of 3 Branch Davidian autobiographies. Please join me in welcoming her.
All right, well, thank you, Marie, for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. On April 19, 2003, immediately after attending the 10th anniversary memorial at the Branch Davidians' Mount Carmel property, I resolved that if they would permit it, I would devote my 2004-05 sabbatical to collecting interviews from several of the survivors to produce an autobiography for each one. While much had been written about the Branch Davidians, and while David Thibodeau had published his autobiography in 1999, none of the other survivors had been given a venue to tell their stories in their own words. I began interviewing Bonnie Haldeman, Sheila Martin, Clive Doyle, and Catherine Madison. I copy-edited and arranged the interviews with Bonnie and Sheila to produce their books, Memories of the Branch Davidians, the autobiography of David Koresh's mother by Bonnie Haldeman, and When They Were Mine, Memoirs of a Branch Davidian Wife and Mother by Sheila Martin, published by Baylor University Press in 2007 and 2009. 4 collected transcripts of the interviews with Catherine Madison have been placed in the Texas collection at Baylor University. Beginning in 2004, I recorded 31 audio tapes of interviews with Clive Doyle. Matthew Whitmer joined me in editing and arranging the transcripts to produce Clive's book, A Journey to Waco, Autobiography of a Branch Davidian, published in 2012. In 1995, sociologist James T. Richardson published an article entitled Manufacturing Consent About Koresh in Stuart Wright's edited volume, Armageddon at Waco. Richardson points out that during the siege of their residence at Mount Carmel by the FBI, the Branch Davidians were dehumanized in the media by the application of the term cult. Cult is a pejorative word that conveys a stereotype that prevents impartial investigation into what a group is really like. Richardson draws on the media analysis of Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky to indicate that the media have the power to depict people who die tragically as either worthy victims or unworthy victims. Worthy victims will be humanized in the media. Their life stories will be told, their faces will be seen, and they will be depicted in ways that promote empathy with their lives and the grief of those who love them. Unworthy victims are dehumanized in the media by various means, one of which is to label them as members of a cult. According to Richardson, quote, those associated with David Koresh at Mount Carmel never made it into the category of worthy victims. Instead, there was an expressed ambiguity about their status. Those living at Mount Carmel, even the children, were never fully humanized in the eyes of the general public. We knew little about them as individuals, including the details of their lives, their hopes and desires, their hobbies, their goals. We did not see many depictions of them as real human beings, end quote. According to Richardson, quote, the dehumanization of those inside Mount Carmel, coupled with the thoroughgoing demonization of Koresh, made it easier for those in authority to develop tactics that seemed organized for disaster, end quote. In different ways, I have been listening to the Branch Davidians for 20 years. In addition to interviewing some of the survivors, I have listened to audio tapes of the negotiations and conversations inside the building recorded by the FBI surveillance devices. There is an easily accessible collection of many of the audio tapes in the Mark Sweat collection and the Texas collection here at Baylor. After listening to the audio and watching the video of the adults and children that was recorded by the Branch Davidians during the siege, I have learned to recognize their voices and their faces. All of the researchers who make the effort to watch the compiled video that has been named Inside Mount Carmel and listen to the audio from the siege know the Branch Davidians as individual human beings. To put a human face on the Branch Davidians, in this presentation, I'm using photographs from the collections of Clive Doyle, Sheila Martin, and the former Mount Carmel Visitors Center that was maintained by Clive Doyle. I thank Baylor University Press for permission to show photographs from Bonnie Haldeman's book, and I thank the Texas collection for several of the photographs shown here. Other photos were taken by Matthew Whitmer, Stuart Wright, and myself. I'm grateful to Matthew Whitmer for creating this composite image of the Branch Davidians who died in 1993 by utilizing photographs from these collections, to which he has added screenshots from the digitized Inside Mount Carmel video. He arranged the photos in the order of the memorial crepe myrtle trees as they were originally planted for each person. When a photograph was unavailable, he inserted a rubbing he took from the memorial stone for that person, which was originally placed underneath the tree. I believe that some of the photographs I will show in this presentation were taken for the Waco Tribune-Herald. I'm using only those photographs that were found in the Visitors Center and Clive Doyle collections. I will show exhibit photos from the criminal trial in 1994 and the civil trial in 2000. I will also show a couple of Sheila Martin's drawings to illustrate her account. On February 28, 1993, ATF agents attempted to carry out a dynamic entry into the residence at the Branch Davidians' Mount Carmel, located within the rural outskirts of Waco, Texas. 6 Branch Davidians and 4 ATF agents died on February 28th. The siege conducted by FBI agents concluded on April 19th, when the FBI's tank and CS gas assault culminated in the fire in which 76 Branch Davidians of all ages died, and from which 9 Branch Davidians escaped. I will present episodes from the history of David Koresh's Branch Davidians as seen through the eyes of Bonnie Haldeman, Sheila Martin, and Clive Doyle. I will include information about the events drawn from the FBI Major Event Log available in the Lee Hancock Collection at Texas State University, San Marcos. More Branch Davidian survivors live in the Waco area, in addition to the ones that I have interviewed. I encourage scholars at Baylor University to collect additional oral histories. I encourage Branch Davidians living in Waco and elsewhere to record their accounts, as should law enforcement agents. The recorded accounts of various people add to the primary sources that may be studied by researchers seeking to understand the very complex events in 1993. Before I proceed further, I wish to point out the distinction between Davidians and Branch Davidians. It is inaccurate to refer to the Branch Davidians as Davidians. These are 2 separate groups, although the Branch Davidians see their prophets, Ben Roden, Lois Roden, and David Koresh, as being in a lineage of prophets going back to the Davidian prophet Victor Hotef, and before him, the Seventh-day Adventist prophet Ellen G. White. The Branch Davidian community in 1993. In 1993, the Branch Davidians consisted of about 130 members, including children. They were multi-ethnic and citizens of various countries. Most of them had Seventh-day Adventist backgrounds. Not all of them were at Mount Carmel on February 28th, the day of the ATF raid. Many were living and working elsewhere, including California. I have compiled information on the Branch Davidians who died in 1993 to give a sense of the composition of the Mount Carmel community. On February 28, 1993, 6 Branch Davidians died as a result of the ATF raid. Perry Jones, who was David Koresh's father-in-law, Winston Blake, Peter Hipsman, and Peter Gent, for whom we do not have a photo, was on top of the water tower. Jadine Wendell and Michael Schroeder. Mike Schroeder was the father of 1 and stepfather of 3. He was working at the Branch Davidians' car repair shop on Farm Road 2491, not far from Loop 340, when the ATF raid took place beginning at 9:45 a.m. on February 28th. That afternoon, about 5 p.m., Mike was shot and killed by ATF agents stationed on the property behind Mount Carmel as he attempted to walk back and rejoin his wife and children. The FBI special agent in charge did not permit his body to be picked up until March 4th. I thank Mike Schroeder's mother, Sandy Canizo, for sending this photograph. At the beginning of the siege, 21 children were sent out by their parents, beginning with Angelica and Crystal Sonobi, who were brought out by their mother, Floresita Sonobi, at 8:55 p.m. on February 28th. After that, Sita Sonobi was the woman who walked, then drove children down the Mount Carmel driveway, where they were picked up at the intersection of Double E Ranch Road and Farm Road 2491. The last child out was Heather Jones on March 5th. On April 19th, 22 children, from babies to age 13, died along with their mothers inside a concrete vault with an open doorway, which had survived with its contents intact a fire in 1983 that had burned down the administration building. Lisa Marie Martin, age 13, was with her oldest brother, Wayne Joseph Martin, age 20. A tank drove through the front of the building to the open doorway of the vault and gassed that area from 11:31 to 11:55 a.m. 2 of the children who died in the vault were infants who were born and died during the CS gas assault and fire. The 2 pregnant women were Nicole Gant Little and Aisha Garfus Summers. 14 of the children, including the trauma-born infants, were David Koresh's biological children. The children also include Lisa Martin, Rachel Sylvia, the 5 children of Julieta Santoyo, also known as Juliet Martinez, and Melissa Morrison, daughter of Rosemary Morrison from England. 7 teenagers, ages 14 to 19, died at Mount Carmel on April 19th. Jennifer Andrade was age 19, Sherry Doyle, 18, Vanessa Henry, 19, Michelle Jones, 18, Anita Marie Martin, 18, Sheila Renee Martin, 15, and Aisha Garfus Summers, 17. Michelle Jones was the mother of 3. Aisha Garfus Summers was the mother of 1, and she was pregnant. The 53 adults who died on April 19th were of all ages, various ethnicities, and half of them were citizens of countries other than the United States. 27 adults were Americans. They were African Americans, Mexican American, Asian Americans of various ethnicities, and Euro Americans. 2 Australian adults were 24-year-old twins, Peter Gent and Nicole Gent Little. Most of the 21 British adults had Jamaican origins. Abadawalo Davies was from Nigeria. Clifford Sellers, the sole white Englishman who died, was the Branch Davidians' artist and Clive's good friend. The British include Doris Fagan and Yvette Fagan, the mother and wife of Livingston Fagan. 6 members of a single family died. Zilla Henry, along with her 5 children ranging in age from 19 to 28. The one person with Canadian citizenship was novelette Sinclair Hipsman, whom Bonnie Haldeman considered her best friend. They had worked cleaning jobs together. We do not have a photo of Pablo Cohen, the one Israeli. The one New Zealander was Rebecca Saipea. Sheila Martin, Clive Doyle, and Bonnie Haldeman. Clive Doyle was baptized a Seventh-day Adventist in Melbourne, Australia when he was 10 years old, after he and his mother, Edna Doyle, converted to Seventh-day Adventism. In 1956, when he was 15, Clive and Edna intellectually converted to Victor Hougheff's Davidian Seventh-day Adventism. Houghef had established the Davidian community in Waco in 1935. In 1964, when Clive was 23, he and Edna read themselves into converting to Ben Roden's Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventism, which Roden founded in 1955. In 1966, Clive and 3 other people were called to travel from Australia to Mount Carmel Center. They thought it was in preparation to go settle in Israel, but that move never occurred. While Clive was living at Mount Carmel under Ben Roden as prophet, he married. Their oldest daughter, Karen, was born in 1971 at Mount Carmel. Their youngest daughter, Sherry, was born in 1974. A couple of years later, his wife moved to California, taking the girls. When they divorced, his wife gave Clive custody of the girls, and Edna came from Australia to help raise them. Sheila Martin became a Davidian Seventh-day Adventist in 1963 when she was 16, after she became with a Davidian family that lived upstairs in her family's house in Boston. They introduced her to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the Saturday Sabbath, eating kosher and a healthy vegetarian diet, and Davidian theology. When members of this family became Branch Davidians, after studying the literature they had received from Ben Roden, Sheila also became a Branch Davidian. Sheila moved to New York City when she was 21, and there at a Seventh-day Adventist church she met the young man she would marry, Douglas Wayne Martin. Sheila was 25 when they married in 1972. Wayne completed his master's degree in library science at Columbia University in 1 year, during which time their oldest child, Wayne Joseph Martin, was born. They lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, while Wayne earned his law degree at Harvard University. Their oldest daughter, Anita Marie Martin, was born in 1974 in Boston. During this time, Sheila met occasionally with Branch Davidians who came from New Bedford, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and Wayne was a nominal Seventh-day Adventist. After Wayne graduated from Harvard Law School, they moved back to New York City, where he worked as a librarian at Yeshiva University. During this time, their third child, Sheila Renee Martin, was born. Wayne obtained a job as law librarian at North Carolina Central University, so Durham was where their fourth child, Lisa Marie Martin, was born in 1980. A family crisis occurred in 1982 when their infant son, Jamie, contracted bacterial meningitis. During the despairing days at the hospital, Sheila often called Mount Carmel for supportive talks with Lois Roden. Sheila frequently spoke with Vernon Howell, later known as David Koresh, who arrived at Mount Carmel in 1981 when he was 22. Sheila was grateful for his kindness. Sheila, like all the surviving Branch Davidians, refers to him as David, retroactively to the time when his name was Vernon Howell. Jamie survived, but he was severely disabled. Jamie's illness prompted Wayne to study the Bible and attend church again. From 1982 to 1984, Sheila continued talking with people at Mount Carmel by telephone. In January 1984, the Martins received an audio tape Bible study from David. After Wayne overheard Sheila playing the tape, Wayne listened to the tape carefully himself and looked up the Bible passages. 2 months later, Sheila and Jamie traveled to Mount Carmel to hear David's Bible studies during Passover week. In August, David, along with novelette Sinclair, came to visit the Martins in North Carolina. Wayne, Sheila, and the children visited David's group in Texas for Passover week in 1985. At that time, David and his followers were staying at a campground at Mahia. They had left Mount Carmel because of the violence of George Roden, the son of Ben and Lois Roden. Wayne and Sheila listened to David's Bible studies. After returning to North Carolina, Wayne resigned from his job, bought a school bus, and moved his family in the bus to the camp the Branch Davidians had constructed in the piney forest near Palestine, Texas. The Branch Davidians were living inside old school buses, and the Martin family turned their bus into living quarters. Sheila was pregnant with Daniel, so in 1986, Wayne took her to New York City, where Daniel was born. All the Branch Davidians I have interviewed look back fondly on their time living in the Palestine camp. Sheila also fondly tells the story of how Kimberly, her youngest child, was born in 1989 in a pink room in a house at Mount Carmel. Bonnie Haldeman was born and raised in Houston. Her mother was a devout Seventh-day Adventist and had taken Vernon to Seventh-day Adventist Church and Sabbath school when he was a little boy. Bonnie joined the Branch Davidians at the Palestine camp in August 1985 over an argument with her husband, Roy Haldeman, at their house in Chandler over the extent to which Bonnie could assist David and his wife, Rachel, with their new son, Cyrus. Bonnie joined the Branch Davidians primarily to be close to her first grandchild. She made many good friends, and she was motivated to stay with them to be close to her grandchildren who were born in subsequent years. Bonnie continued doing cleaning work while she lived at the camp. She bought a bus and shared that living space with her friend Novelette Sinclair. David was often away in Los Angeles to promote his music and proselytize. He also went to Hawaii and Australia to proselytize. As new converts joined the group at Palestine, they built small huts in which to live. Bonnie, Clive Doyle, Jimmy Riddle, Wayne Martin, and others traveled to California to work at various jobs. In Hawaii, Bonnie and Clive operated a bakery. Bonnie was back in Texas working at cleaning jobs when the Branch Davidians returned to Mount Carmel in 1988. They were able to return because George Roden was in jail. In her autobiography, Bonnie tells of how hard they worked to clean up the houses that had fallen into disrepair while George controlled the property. She reports that in one house they found pornography and materials to make methamphetamine. David turned these things over to the sheriff's department and told the Branch Davidians not to go into that house. Bonnie tells of having tea parties for Cyrus and his sister Star and their friends in her house at Mount Carmel. Bonnie reports that she was aware that David was having children with other women who were considered his wives by the Branch Davidians. Bonnie loved all her grandchildren and was closest to the older ones. Cyrus and Star, whose mother was Rachel, David's legal wife. Serenity C., whose mother was Michelle Jones, Rachel's younger sister. Dayland, whose mother was Nicole Gent. And Sky and Scooter, whose mother is Dana Okamoto. Bonnie did not have the opportunity to get to know her youngest grandchildren. Bonnie reports that she did not understand the theological rationale given for David having so many children with different women. At that time, the legal age in Texas for marriage with parental permission was 14. Bonnie was aware that David had begun having sex with one of his wives when she was 12. Bonnie herself had given birth to David when she was 14. Within the Branch Davidian apocalyptic and cultural context, the adults did not view David's sexual activities as constituting child abuse. Contrary to what many in the public assume, the ATF raid was not justified by David's having sex with underage girls because child abuse does not come under ATF jurisdiction. It was a matter for Texas authorities. Social workers with the Department of Child Protective Services had investigated allegations of child abuse and closed the case for lack of evidence. In 1989, Bonnie's husband, Roy, moved to Mount Carmel to get their marriage back on track. In August 1990, with David's encouragement, Bonnie started taking nursing courses at McLennan Community College. By April 1991, Bonnie had concluded that she and Roy needed to leave Mount Carmel. The decision to leave was finalized after Bonnie and David argued. Bonnie and Roy lived in an apartment in Waco while she finished school. Then they moved back to their house in Chandler. Events at Mount Carmel in 1993. Clive and Sheila were in the residence at Mount Carmel on February 28, 1993, when the ATF raid took place. Clive was in his first-floor room on the southwest front of the building when he heard gunfire. When he rushed down the hallway toward the front door, he found Perry Jones crawling along the floor, screaming he had been shot. Clive and Livingston Malcolm helped Perry to a bed in a room away from the front of the building. Clive was told that Winston Blake had been shot in his room on the west back corner of the men's dormitory section on the first floor. When Clive went into that room, he saw Winston's body on the floor, which was wet with water from the plastic water tanks located outside the window that had been punctured by bullets. After checking on Perry, Clive went to the southeast corner of the long hallway where Wayne Martin was shouting into the speakerphone in his office. Wayne had dialed 911 and was urgently asking that the shooting stop. Wayne shouted, quote, "There are 75 men around our building and they're shooting at us at Mount Carmel. Tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off," end quote. David was wounded and lying in the hallway on the second floor, going into the room in the central tower. As Wayne communicated with Lieutenant Larry Lynch to establish a ceasefire, Clive and Greg Summers alternated in going up and down the stairs to convey messages between Wayne and David. When ATF agents arrived and covered cattle trailers, Sheila was in her second-floor bedroom on the front southeast corner of the building. She had placed Jamie by the front window so he could feel the sunlight and listen to the birds. When gunshots came through the window, Jamie's face was cut by the broken glass. Sheila and Daniel, age 6, and Kimberly, age 4, took shelter behind a bed away from the window. When there was a brief lull in the shooting, Sheila pulled Jamie away from the window. Sheila could hear Wayne in his office below her room shouting into the speakerphone. In 1993, Bonnie was caring for an invalid in the patient's home. Bonnie had gotten home at 7:30 a.m. on the morning of February 28th and had gone to bed. At 10:30 a.m., she received a call from her sister-in-law telling her to turn on the television. During the siege, Bonnie went to Waco every weekend when she was off from work. She began making preparations to take care of her 12 grandchildren when they were sent out. She planned to care for them until their mothers were released from jail. Early in the siege, Clive went out the tunnel, part of which was a buried school bus, into the covered portion of the unfinished storm shelter. There he dug a single grave for 4 bodies: Jadine Wendell, Perry Jones, Peter Hipsman, and Winston Blake. On March 5th at 5:50 p.m., Clive went outside with Jimmy Riddle and Mark Wendell to retrieve Peter Gent's body from the top of the water tower. On March 8th, Kevin Whitecliff, Brad Branch, and Oliver Gyarfers were permitted by the FBI to go out front and bury Peter's body on the other side of the driveway. They marked the grave with plastic flowers so tanks would not run over it. According to survivors, tanks ran over the grave frequently. On March 13th, the FBI began directing spotlights at the building at night to obscure future SOS messages, which the Branch Davidians had flashed the previous evening. The bright spotlights also had the effect of disrupting the Branch Davidians' sleep. A total of 14 Branch Davidian adults came out. On March 21, 7 adults came out at various times. At 1 p.m., Sheila Martin and Ophelia Santoyo were among the last group to come out. At 6 p.m., some of the Branch Davidians' vehicles were damaged and removed by tanks. That evening at 11:15 p.m., the FBI began blasting high-decibel, irritating sounds at the Branch Davidians through loudspeakers. David and Steve Schneider expressed anger to the negotiators and said that the people who had been planning on coming out had changed their minds. On March 23rd, Livingston Thagan was the last Branch Davidian adult to come out before April 19th. Livingston holds an MDiv degree from a Seventh-day Adventist seminary in England, and he was sent out on March 23rd to explain David Koresh's theology to FBI agents. After the conclusion of Passover, on April 14th, David advised the FBI through his attorney that he would come out after he wrote his little book, giving his interpretations of the 7 seals of the book of Revelation. Also on April 14th, David sent out his signed contract to retain his attorney. On April 16th, David told an FBI negotiator that he had completed composing his interpretation of the first seal. Clive spent most of the siege in the chapel with his daughter Sherry, who would die in the fire, Marjorie Thomas from England, who was severely burned, escaping the fire, and Kevin Whitecliff before he went out with Brad Branch on March 12th. The day or two before April 19th, David instructed that the women staying downstairs should go upstairs. On April 19th, with the CS gas coming in, Clive and others put on gas masks. Clive also put on several jackets and a helmet that had been left behind by an ATF agent. Clive describes how the filter on the mask clogged quickly, but he left the mask on rather than have his face and respiratory passages burned by the gas. Clive describes how the men inside the chapel moved back and forth as tanks penetrated from 2 sides and sprayed gas from nozzles attached to their booms. Just after noon, he heard a shout about fire. He and other men moved behind the wall at the back of the chapel stage. Clive and Thibodeau looked out a hole in the outer wall of the chapel that had been made by a tank. They wondered if they would be shot when they went out. Suddenly, an overwhelming heat overhead pushed Clive to the floor. The area got dark from smoke blowing from the front of the building and being sucked inside the hole in the wall and the chapel. Clive crawled toward the hole. He heard men behind him screaming. He lurched in the direction of the hole, slithered over the rubble, and landed outside on his feet. Once outside, he realized that his jacket was melting, the skin was peeling off his hands, and his neck and ankle were burned. Clive was the 4th and last man out through the hole in the chapel's wall. Jamie Castillo, David Thibodeau, and Derek Lovelock got out ahead of him. When they walked down the driveway with their hands up, they met Rennis Avram, who had jumped from the 2nd floor in the front of the building. Clive saw the 4 men ahead of him going down the driveway, and he was ordered to follow. Like the others, Clive was made to lie face down on the ground with his hands secured behind his back. He was on the ground when he saw the fireball explosion, and he knew then that no one else was coming out. On April 19th, Sheila and other Branch Davidian women were in a halfway house operated by the Salvation Army, where they watched the tank and gas assault on television. When they saw the fire start, they prayed that people would escape. They prayed and prayed and hoped and hoped and hoped until the end. Sheila's 4 oldest children, young Wayne, Anita, young Sheila, and Lisa, and her husband, Wayne Martin, did not come out. They are buried at McLennan County Rusland Cemetery. Bonnie was at work caring for her invalid patient on April 19th. At 6 a.m., she saw on television the tank and gas assault begin. Bonnie went home, and she and Roy watched on their television. Life immediately afterward was a blur for Bonnie. When she arranged for David to be buried in a Tyler cemetery, she thought she would have him cremated. Her mother told her to come to her senses, asking, "Hasn't he been burned enough?" Some of Bonnie's grandchildren are buried at Rusland Cemetery. Sheila worked hard to regain custody of her surviving children, Jamie, Daniel, and Kimberly, who had been sent out on March 1 and 2. She made a home for them. Jamie died in 1998 and is buried with his father and older siblings in Restland Cemetery. In the criminal trial in 1994, Clive, Woodrow Kendrick, and Norman Allison were acquitted of all charges relating to the deaths of 4 ATF agents on February 28, 1993. Clive and Edna moved back to Mount Carmel in 1999, where they operated a visitor center memorializing the events and those who died, including the ATF agents. Edna died in 2001. In March 2006, Clive moved from Mount Carmel into Waco, storing the contents of the former visitor center. In 1996, Bonnie started working in a pediatric clinic in Tyler. Roy died in 2001 and was buried next to David. On January 23, 2009, Bonnie stopped by to pick up her mentally ill sister to take her to the doctor, and the sister stabbed Bonnie through the heart. Bonnie's grave joined those of David and Roy. In conclusion, I have learned from the survivors that I have interviewed, not only Bonnie, Sheila, and Clive, that they are intelligent and good people. Bonnie, Sheila, and Clive have spoken with reporters whenever asked, because they always hope that the media will humanize their loved ones. They remember the deceased ATF agents each year in their memorial service. The surviving Branch Davidian adults with whom I have spoken look for David's return with their loved ones who are sorely missed. Everyone is invited to the 20th anniversary memorial tomorrow, April 19th, which will be held from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the Helen Marie Taylor Museum of Waco History. The address is 701 Jefferson. The names of everyone who died in the federal agent Branch Davidian conflict will be read beginning about 12 noon. I would like to now invite Sheila and Clive to come up here, and they are happy to take some questions. So there's Clive. Sheila, come on up. You can sit or stand. That microphone's on. Whatever you prefer. So, would anyone like to direct questions to Clive and Sheila? Yes, John? There's it.
John Rowland, Constitution.org. The presentations today are focusing on the assault, but I've always regarded the second assault, which was the trial of the Davidians, to be in many ways a more serious assault than the ones that caused the deaths, because what happened in court was a killing of justice and not just of human beings. Can you comment on the trial as you saw it?
There was 11 survivors that ended up being put on trial in San Antonio. We had Judge Walter Smith Jr. from Waco as the federal judge in that case. And to put it in a nutshell, we saw throughout the trial that there was a lot of prejudice, not just by the government agents or the lawyers that were there, but the judge himself. And it didn't seem to matter how often some of the witnesses for the government were caught in lies and misrepresentations throughout the trial. Nobody seemed to get reprimanded for that. On the other hand, unfortunately, our lawyers did not put on a very good defense. Their attitude was that they didn't have to prove us innocent. All they had to do was to create enough doubt to where we would get off basically without a lot of presentation. If the government didn't prove its point, then the jury should rule based on that, the fact that there was doubt about various points that were brought up, they should rule us not guilty. So after 7.5 weeks, or 7 weeks of government witnesses and government presentation, our defense lawyers, I think they put on about a day and a half or so of argument, and from what I recall, there was like 2 witnesses put on the witness stand on our behalf. None of the defendants were allowed to testify, and in spite of all of that, you know, the one-sidedness of the trial, when it came down to the jury coming to make a decision, all of the 11 were found not guilty of the first 2 charges. First charge being conspiracy to murder federal agents. Everybody was found not guilty. Second charge was aiding and abetting the murder of federal agents. All 11 of us were found not guilty. The third count, though, was having a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. 3 of us were found not guilty on that count. Some of the others got a guilty verdict. From what I recall, the judge had given instructions to the jury, something like 90 pages of instructions on just how to vote on the third count. Some of the defendants were found guilty of other lesser charges having to do with weapons and so forth, depending on the various testimony that had been given. At the end of the deliberation and the reading of the verdict, the judge dismissed the jury and let them go. And immediately, both sets of lawyers went up to the judge's bench and said, "Judge, how can you find people guilty of having a weapon during the commission of a crime if they're not guilty of the crime?" And so the judge, I guess he was kind of caught flat-footed. He says, "Well, the jury basically made a mistake. They didn't understand, you know, the instructions, and but I've already dismissed them, and it'd be a lot of trouble to bring them back. They were already probably out of the courtroom, out of the court building, which probably wasn't true because they'd barely left when this presentation went on. But he didn't want to bring them back because he said, all I can do would be to tell them they made a mistake and they'd have to change it, so I'll just waive the third count." On the Monday morning following that decision, which was on a Saturday, on the Monday morning, Ruth Riddle, the only girl in the trial, from what I understand, was getting ready to get on the plane to go back to Canada. Ruth Riddle was one of 3 women that jumped from second-floor windows during the fire. She had broken her ankle when she hit the ground. As a result of that, she fell back into the building and burned her knees and so forth. When I say she fell back into the building, that was because the tanks had taken the whole front of the north end of the building out, so it was kind of all open. And so the way the government presented their description of Ruth Riddle during the trial was that she had jumped out and had second thoughts and tried to run back in and commit suicide. There was no mention that she'd had a broken ankle and that she'd fallen forward again into the building. Anyway, she was about to get on the plane to go back to Canada on the Monday morning after the trial when she was rearrested and taken back to jail on the grounds that, or what we heard was that the judge had changed his mind. He'd reinstated the third count. And several months later, on the basis of reinstating the third count and basically the prejudice of the judge, he chose to treat the other 8 people that were still in custody, because the 3 of us that were found not guilty, we basically walked away right after the court hearing. The rest of them, on the prejudice of the judge, he took the attitude that they were guilty basically of all of the charges, in spite of what the jury had ruled, and proceeded to give most of the men 40-year sentences. Ruth Riddle got a 5-year sentence, and another girl, which hadn't gone through the trial at all, got 3 years. And so we ended up having to go to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Louisiana to appeal the judge's decision or sentence. Unfortunately, the lawyers that went to Louisiana did not appeal the verdict. They only appealed the sentence. And so the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that, yes, the sentencing was excessive and they needed to be resentenced. But based on their decision, they sent the case or the process of being resentenced back to the very same judge, Judge Walter Smith, who proceeded to give them the 40 years all over again. So then it took 2 efforts to go to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. On the second time the lawyers went, the Supreme Court ultimately reduced all of the men's sentences down to 15 years. And so most of them were able to get out in less than 15 years based on good behavior and accruing, some good time, all except Livingston. Livingston Fagan had been a guinea pig type situation, you might say, during the trial. He was the only black man that had survived other than Norman Allison, but Norman Allison hadn't been in the building throughout the whole siege. So Livingston Fagan, who you saw his picture up on the screen just a while ago, he was picked by the government to be the shooter that shot one of the agents at the north end of the building. And even though he didn't fit the description and he wasn't in that particular area when it happened, being the only black man that survived, they wanted to make him the shooter. In my case, they wanted to make me the lighter of the fire based on the fact that my hands were burnt. Probably 2/3 of the way through the trial, my lawyer said they've finally decided not to pursue you being the one that lit the fire. And I said, well, why have they changed their mind? He said, well, they've got no evidence, so they're going to drop that. But by the time we had the congressional hearings in Washington, D.C., one of the fire investigators that they had proceeded to point blank blame me for the fire in that panel hearing based on the fact that, like I said, my hands were burnt. And so I guess the congressional panel didn't accept that, and of course the jury didn't accept that, so like I said, I was exonerated and managed to come out after being incarcerated for almost a year. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you, Clive.
I'm kind of long-winded, so excuse me.
Yeah, you can see why I recorded 31 audio tapes. But of course, they're always informative. Everything Clive says is very informative. We're going to need to wrap up in a few minutes, but I wanted to ask Sheila if do you have any, what comments would you like to make before we close?
Well, many times I tell people that when you're getting ready to
Hold it up to you.
when you're getting ready to take a step of faith and you hope that you're going to read your Bible, learn more of God, try to be a good person, try to look forward to going to heaven, and just try to be what you think Jesus would want you to be. You think all it is just day by day living a good life. Something comes up that tries you more than you ever thought. Even though you knew the disciples went through things, even though you knew part of living was trusting in God, going through different things. When we finished coming out in 93, spoke to my mother and I told her, I said, well, this is what the disciples, they've gone through things. It'll be okay. I'm not to be afraid. But in April 19th, that's when you realize that your real faith and your real hope had to be strong then, because you saw what you thought was your life of being a wife and mother and watching children grow, teaching them things, all these different things that you believed was part of your experience with God and your hope of the future. You began to realize that this was more, and you had to really hold on. And when you had that sinking feeling of what's going to happen, you saw all your family and felt flames on your back as if you were there with them. You had to have that hope of knowing that you'll see them again and that God is going to take you through all these different things. And then you have to hope that you can help somebody else, that your life will be more than just what you had before, but what you can make it, and hope you can help other people get to the kingdom.
Thank you, Sheila. I think we're going to need to stop. Certainly they'll be around at the memorial. You can talk to them. But Marie has some announcements for you. Thank you very much, everyone.